We begin with the fallout from the FBI search of former President Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago. Joining me now, NBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, NBC White House correspondent Carol Lee, Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, and Donell Harvin, former Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for Washington, D.C., and now an MSNBC Homeland Security analyst. So, Ken, the very latest on the investigation, the increased security, the concern about threats to the FBI, to law enforcement, the criticism of Merrick Garland, all of it.
All of it. And, well, first of all, Andrea, the most disturbing part right now is that the FBI and DHS issued a joint intelligence bulletin yesterday saying they had seen a massive uptick in specific and credible threats to federal law enforcement. This was reflected reporting that we did last week that in open source intelligence firms are also seeing this in message boards and chat rooms online. And we're not just talking about rhetoric here. We're talking about specific threats. They're even naming FBI agents and family members, and they are saying that these kinds of threats could increase if more action is taken in this investigation. It's just a really disturbing time. And
in one part of that, this is partly because we believe they were named and exposed. The agents who served the search warrant, who were part of that search warrant, the federal magistrate, were named publicly by people on Truth Social.
That's right. A copy of that search warrant was leaked to certain media outlets with the names exposed, and those names were published. And the FBI officials I've talked to are very disturbed about that.
And Donell Harvin, what kind of precautions do individuals, does the FBI, does Homeland have to take? We see increased security around some facilities, some buildings here in Washington. What do they have to do?
The FBI is facing what they call unprecedented levels of threats to their facilities and their agents. They have protocols and processes in place to protect those individuals, as just previously mentioned. However, there is a standing all nationwide alert for federal law enforcement to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity, particularly online threats or suspicious individuals who may be approaching the buildings that they occupy. Particularly concerning after the Cincinnati attack last week, that individual also was posting threats online and Truth Social, as previously mentioned. So it's a very, very tense environment right now for federal law enforcement, and they're still trying to find their way through the current threat environment that precipitated the search of Mar-a-Lago last week.
Carol Lee, you and your team have some incredible reporting, the scramble to pack documents from the White House for Donald Trump on his way to Mar-a-Lago. The fact that until after January 6th, he wasn't preparing to leave. He wasn't acknowledging that still hasn't acknowledged that he lost in November. And what are the implications for that, along with his claims of having declassified documents before he left without leaving, as far as we know, any paper trail?
Well, that's right, Andrea, that we learned that the president's exit from the White House was very chaotic in those final hours. People just throwing things into boxes at random, really just trying to get him out of there. And we also know that the president was described to us by several people who worked for him as a pack rat. So there was a ton of documents, papers, things that were just he was surrounded by. And really what we gathered in our reporting was this portrait of a president. We know that President Trump was sloppy. He didn't really have regard for documents and storing and processes and the Presidential Records Act and things like that. But his mindset about these things was similar to how we saw his mindset be toward staff, whether it's cabinet officials or other, that they worked for him, not the U.S. government. And he had a very similar attitude towards documents, classified intelligence, things like that they were his to keep. And so you had aides around him constantly trying to get things from him, retrieve them back, store them properly, and to keep certain things from him. And sometimes officials told us that he would ask for things that were classified and they would give him a copy of something. And he didn't like the photocopies. He wanted the original. And so there was this whole effort to try to get some sort of process around the president while he was in the White House that didn't really work. It had fits and starts. It would from time to time. But generally speaking, his mindset was that these were his and he could do what he wanted with them, Former National Security Advisor John Bolton told us that the president was constantly just grabbing intelligence documents. And so that's the backdrop to what we have here. And now you have the president saying, well, I declassified all this. John Bolton also saying that that's not a process he was aware of, that anything that went to the residents from the Oval Office was automatically declassified. He says that is not something that he was briefed on. He's unfamiliar with that. And he would be familiar with process like that. So the president saying that he can just declassify something at will, it doesn't really work like that. And also, that doesn't even speak to the fact that the laws that are being cited here for the reason why the FBI went in and did this search, it doesn't matter whether those documents were classified. But Andrea, generally, this is a president who left hastily, who hoarded paper, who thought it was his own and that he could do what he wanted with it. And he was surrounded by people who were constantly trying to put some sort of process in place and follow the law.
And Ben Rhodes, you've been in the White House at those levels as Deputy National Security Advisor, of course, and during the Obama transition. And you know what presidents can take and what they can declassify and what belongs in the National Archives. Tell us what's wrong with this picture.
Well, Andrea, just about everything is wrong with this picture. I mean, first of all, there's no reason for him to take any classified material whatsoever. And frankly, there's a process for the archives to take custody of that material. And if a president or people who maintain a clearance somehow want to get access to that information, they can go through a process. But the reality is, if he is going to claim that he declassified this, there's no record of that. There's no record that he told the intelligence community of that. Frankly, the fact that they're continuing to treat these documents as classified shows you that they're not declassified. Otherwise, we'd all be talking about what's in the documents. And another important thing, Andrea, is that these would be documents marked top secret, marked top secret SCI, which is an even higher level of classification, marked secret. And the reason that they're marked that way is because the documents don't just describe, in all likelihood, assessments of the intelligence community. They would be describing methods of collection or U.S. military movements. And the question of declassification, therefore, has to extend not just to what's in the document, but into all the intelligence collection derives and how that material was acquired. And there's no way on earth that Donald Trump went through the process of notifying the intelligence community down to the level of the people who might be involved in that collection. And so this is clearly a post facto excuse that he's drummed up that has no basis in reality. And once those documents leave the White House compound, they are not secure. And it's one thing to be sloppy with documents in the White House, which is a secure facility. Once those documents leave the White House, once they leave a government facility, they are incredibly vulnerable to any foreign adversary that wants to get their hands on them, try to exploit them. And we still don't know what the purpose is for him taking these documents. And if they were just casual things that he took by mistake, presumably he would have returned those documents when he was ordered to, weeks ago. So nothing about this adds up. It just feels like he's flailing around with excuse after excuse. Often the excuses themselves are contradictory.
Well, in fact, let's watch what Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, who has dealt with sensitive documents as a senator on Judiciary Committee and other committees, also as a former prosecutor, her reactions yesterday to me on Meet the Press.
My first reaction is to stand with the men and women of the FBI who are simply doing their jobs. What was found in Mar-a-Lago, we don't know exactly what's in those documents, but what we do know is it rose to the level of a search warrant that a federal judge approved. It is so important that these documents remain in safe locations. And Mar-a-Lago, where you can check out croquet sets and tennis rackets and golf clubs, that's not one of them.
Which is, Ben, exactly your point, the point that Carol is making about the haphazard way this was done, that there's no evidence that he declassified anything and that those papers don't show any indication of that. Let me ask you also, Ken Dilanian, about one of the charges, the potential charges that were outlined in the search warrant, which is obstruction, which Chuck Rosenberg was signaling to me yesterday was a very serious one. What does that mean in terms of potentially what could have happened to those documents, either on their way to Mar-a-Lago or there? Could they have torn off some of the language on the top of each document when it is a classified document? Could they have been destroyed? Could they have been altered? Or is that just the fact that they're out of government custody? I'm not sure.
No, the latter would be the first charge, which is theft of government records.
Right.
This obstruction charge That's what you just said is exactly what it brings to mind, because it makes it illegal to mutilate, conceal, or withhold to obstruct a government investigation. And so it suggests at least that the FBI has suspicions that something like that happened, that markings were changed, documents were destroyed. Now, we know that the president had a habit of ripping up documents. And that, the way that's described, it doesn't appear to have been malicious, more like negligence. But in this case, with this specific crime, it suggests they believe there was an overt act, or they suspect an overt act to try to cover something up. Very serious charge.